Previous exercise, we configured the networking component of the failover cluster, and now we are now ready to install the failover cluster feature on both the nodes, that is node 1 and node 2. So let's go ahead and do this activity. So once again, I will click on add rows and features, and on this page I will select role and feature based installation. Next, select my node. In this case it's node 2, and failover cluster is a feature, it's not a role, so hence I will click on next on this, and from this list I will select failover clustering. Now I can do it this way, where I can install it through the GUI interface, that's the GUI interface, or I can do the same thing using a PowerShell command as listed here, right? So using this PowerShell command, I can also install the failover cluster feature. So I'm going to do it through PowerShell, and I'll hit on enter to this, and there it installs the failover cluster feature on node 2. Now I'm going to repeat this also on node 1. One of the most important tasks with reference to failover clustering is to validate the cluster configuration. Validation is something that we need to run before building the cluster, and validation is a process that you're going to follow even in future if you find that your cluster is not responding properly or is generating some kind of errors. You can still validate the cluster and find out where the problem actually is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first validate the configuration with reference to the networking, with reference to the storage, with reference to the nodes. So all of these components are going to be checked and validated, and I'm going to get a report at the end of the whole process to let me know on whether I can go ahead and build my cluster. So I'm clicking on this option over here on the right hand side which says validate configuration. So I click on validate configuration, and I'm going to click on next to this. It says please select your servers, and I'm going to click on browse and select both my nodes that I've set up out here. So it's going to be node 1, node 2, click on OK, click on OK. Now please understand, you need not do this activity on both the nodes. You can run it from any one node. So I'm going to click on next to this, and then it prompts me on whether you want to run all the tests or only test that you select. At this moment, since it's the first time that we're building the cluster, I would like to run all the tests. So it shows me the list of tests it's going to run. As you can see, it's a lot of different components, right from the software updates, right from whether both the nodes are at the same level with reference to Windows updates, your drivers, your network interface card, your firewall configuration, your storage, OS, all of these things. So I'm going to click on next to this, and now it's performing. Okay, as you can see, it has completed running the test, and based on Microsoft supported solution for cluster, right, you should ensure that your tests succeed. Warnings are fine. So as you can see, I can see some warning with reference to my IP configuration. That is fine, that is acceptable, but it cannot fail with a red icon. So as you can see, I can see a yellow warning icon. That's acceptable, right? So that means I have successfully met all the requirements for the cluster, right? And if you notice, the warnings are with reference to a default gateway, which I can safely ignore for the time being, because I'm not in a routed environment at this moment. I'm not with a routing configuration, so I can safely ignore this error. So I'm going to click on finish. Or in case if you want to view the report, if you want to view the detailed report, you can click on this option, view report, and that's what I would recommend most of you to do. View the report and see what it says, you'll get a lot of understanding on what all test it has done with reference to all these components, that is inventory, network, storage, and system configuration. At this moment, I'm going to close this out. I'm going to click on finish. And now I think I'm ready to build the cluster. Now, in order to build the cluster, I'm going to do a very simple thing out here. I'm going to click on this option which says over here, create cluster. And to create the cluster, I'm going to click on next to this. And once again, I'm going to add both my nodes. I'm going to add node 1 and node 2. Once added, I'm going to click on next to this. All right. And one of the first questions it will ask me is access point for administering the cluster. Now, this you can consider as the name that I'm going to assign to my cluster. So, let's call this something like Contoso cluster, right? Now, this name that I assigned to the cluster is also known as the CNO, cluster named object, and this name also gets registered in Active Directory as a kind of a computer account, but you do not refer to it as a computer account, but you refer to it as a CNO, that's the cluster named object. So, I need to ensure that it also has an IP address. So, let me give an IP address. Let me assign an IP address that is not used. An IP address of, let's say, 50, right? And I'm going to click on next to this. And here it gives me a summary of what it's going to do, that we are ready to create the cluster. And I do have a tick mark over here which says add all eligible storage to the cluster, and that means that I would want the cluster to detect my storage accordingly and add it into the cluster rather than me doing it manually later on. So, I'm going to click on next to this, and here it's now creating the cluster. It's also creating the CNO object in Active Directory and detecting the various configurations that we have made up till now in the cluster. All right, done. So, my cluster is created. So, if you notice over here, I can see both my nodes that have been added into the cluster, node 1, node 2. This is going to be my cluster name, the CNO, that's Contoso cluster. The quorum model is taken up is node and disk majority, and the IP address of the cluster is 192.168.0.50. That's the one I assigned while creating the cluster. And now that the cluster is created, I click on finish, and let me see what process did it follow to build the cluster. So, this is my cluster console, and it gives me a summary. This is a summary page of the cluster where I can see a bit of information about my cluster. I can see events in the cluster. I can see the witness disk in the cluster. I can see the subnets. So, let me now drill down to the cluster and get more information. Number one, do I have any roles on the cluster? No, not at this moment, but I'm going to configure a role on the cluster later, a highly available role on the cluster. Let me check both the nodes. Do they show up here? Yes, both the nodes show up here, node 1, node 2. What about storage? Let's check storage. Do I see both the disk in the cluster? Right. Yes, I can see disk 1 and I can see disk 2. Right. Now, if you remember, in the cluster, we had set up two disks, one disk approximately about 1 GB, and it has taken that disk as a witness, and the next drive, which is a 10 GB disk, is taken that disk as available storage. So this is the disk that I can use for any application that's going to be clustered in this environment, and this is the disk that it has taken as a witness, and that's exactly what we wanted, and that's what the cluster has done. Let's check the networks. So, I'm going to click on networks over here, and under networks I can see that it has enabled this network for cluster and client, that is 192.168.0.0. So let's check this with our failover cluster diagram that we have out here. So I'm going to click on this, and if you notice, this is my prod network, that is 192.168.0.10. The heartbeat network does not have any IP address. It doesn't have any IPv4 address. It does have an IPv6 address. The SAN network is on the 10 range, right? So let me now validate this information by referring to the cluster. So I'm on the cluster. So it says 192.168.0.0 is used for cluster and client communication. So when you say client, it actually refers to the production network. So that's correct. And this is a 10 network which it's going to use for storage. So obviously it's not going to be used for any kind of cluster communication or any kind of production traffic. So this is again correct, since I'm using this for storage. And the last one, which says cluster only, and if you notice, it's got an IPv6 address. So this is only used for cluster communication, and that's the heartbeat network. And so that completes the process of building the cluster. And in the next exercise, in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you how to configure a highly available role on the cluster.